What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony, lawyer by trade, came to China to study Chinese foreign policy and economics, and now I work in an executive role, and I basically put this channel together to help my mates learn about China on a Friday night. I would sit down with them at the bar and sort of talk to them about what was happening in China, and then I thought, man, I should start throwing some of this stuff up on YouTube and see if there's anyone else who's interested in this crazy, interesting place called China and what's going on. So if that's your jam, if that's something you might be interested in, maybe consider subscribing. And if you do like this video, make sure you smash that like button. For a new YouTuber, that is our crack cocaine, that is our heroin. Now, the last few episodes have been pretty Hong Kong heavy. We need to jump into Hong Kong first this time, but it's not going to be as dominant as the last couple of weeks. So without further ado, let's jump into this week's update. Okay, so this week there hasn't been any major stories coming out of Hong Kong itself specifically. What we do need to talk about, however, are the reactions to the big stories from last week on the ground in Hong Kong, in the mainland, and internationally. So what were those two big stories? Well, the first was the landslide victory of the pan-democratic candidates in the local elections at the beginning of last week. This week, there hasn't been any major escalation in the protests or the violence on the ground. There have been protests and there has been violence, but if you remember the last few weeks, there's been a ratcheting up, there's been escalation almost every day in some cases. But this week, there hasn't been any major escalations. Now, why is that? Well, one of the major reasons might be because those elections, that landslide victory, sent a massive signal to the establishment that the protest enjoyed widespread support amongst the people. So this is basically saying it's up to the SAR government to play ball, and the ball is in their court. Like we were saying last week, the question of the level of support the wider protest movement had was up in the air. But after the elections, it was a clear signal that the support was overwhelming and the anger was directed mainly at the establishment and the administration. So now it's up to them to make some changes. The second major story of last week, of course, was the US passing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Now, there are two main features of this act. One is that it requires the US State Department to produce a report every year assessing Hong Kong and ascertaining whether it is sufficiently autonomous, and if not, then Hong Kong loses its privileged access to the American market and capital markets and some other privileges within the relationship, which it's had for decades, and which allows it to be this massive financial hub in East Asia. And the second is it empowers the US government to put sanctions on individuals who, quote, undermine Hong Kong autonomy or human rights under the one country, two systems arrangement with China. Now, this week, that bill was signed into law by Trump. It's up in the air how keen he was to sign that, but it was basically veto-proof because this bill has been bipartisan in both the houses. So what was the Chinese reaction to Trump signing this bill this week? Well, it was very loud and it was very furious, but it was largely symbolic and it was mostly for a domestic audience. The two major moves that the Chinese government made in Beijing was, one, suspending US naval and ship visits to Hong Kong harbor, and two, introducing sanctions on US-based non-government organizations like Human Rights Watch or the National Endowment for Democracy, which they claim has promoted violence in Hong Kong. Now, these are not really major steps, and like I said, they're very symbolic. As for ship visits, this has happened in the past. Actually, in 2018, the Chinese put a ban on US ships visiting Hong Kong harbor. They lifted the ban later in that year, so this has been done before, and it's typically used as a mechanism to express dissatisfaction in Beijing. As for the sanctions on the NGOs, it's not exactly like Human Rights Watch was particularly welcome in the mainland in the first place. So this isn't really any major policy responses from Beijing. And we'll talk about this later with the trade talks. The trade talks are still on the table and still going ahead. So it seems that both sides, the US and China, have been able to separate these two policy areas and deal with them individually. While we're still in Hong Kong, we need to quickly talk about the economy. As you know, from the last few weeks of reports, Hong Kong is in a technical recession. It's predicted that it's going to move into a deeper recession in 2020, and that there are serious financial vulnerabilities in the system because of the amount of leverage in the economy, and there's a risk with the currency and the financial system because of this leverage and the trajectory of recession in the next year or so. The data that's coming out is increasingly poor. We know that in October and September, for example, exports are down 10%, retail spending is down 24%, and tourist numbers are down 50%. And poor old Disneyland reported that their numbers are down 90%. I don't feel particularly bad about Disney, though. They seem to be making plenty of money in China as it is. In response to these issues, Carrie Lam, the executive head of the SAR government, announced that there are going to be stimulus measures going forward. There's going to be government spending in order to soften the blow and the effect of this economic slowdown moving into 2020. Okay, now we need to talk about Huawei. Now, Huawei is a huge topic. Everyone, of course, has most probably heard of the controversial major Chinese telecommunications company. But for our purposes here, we just need to talk about a couple of stories relevant to the wider Huawei developments this week. Now, the first is very interesting. A Japanese lab and UBS took apart Huawei's latest flagship phone, the Mate 30, which is competing with the likes of, say, the iPhone 11. And they were able to conclude that this latest phone, this latest major flagship device from Huawei, has no US input in terms of the actual hardware, which would mean that Huawei has been able to successfully build devices that have no US input in the hardware itself sooner than experts thought. Now, it should be pointed out here that we're talking about US inputs only. This does not mean that everything was created and sourced within China itself. Huawei still relies on input devices and parts from places like Japan, Germany, South Korea, and Taiwan, all of whom are either de facto or de jure allies of the United States. But it is impressive how quickly they've been able to move away from reliance on US hardware input. The bigger challenge for Huawei going forward still is creating an indigenous operating system that can compete with Google's Android. This is a much bigger challenge, and tech people have been saying this from the beginning. However, this development this week does show that they are moving ahead with significant speed. Now, the second story from this week is that Huawei is suing the US FCC for choking its sales by saying that it's a national security threat without evidence. That is the statement that they're making. So that lawsuit will be going forward, and it's quite an aggressive PR push in the United States to put the onus on the US government to prove that they are to establish in a civil court that they are a security threat. So that is from this week as well. And the third story about Huawei this week is a domestic story within China. And there's a gentleman called Li Hongyuan who was an ex-employee of Huawei, and he was actually detained because he was suing the company in Xinjiang for back pay. He was detained and he was released recently because he had recordings of conversations with top executives with the company. The official statement was that he was detained for leaking secrets, but it turns out that wasn't really the case. Now, this caused a bit of a PR disaster within China itself, with many Chinese, particularly middle-class Chinese in major cities, enraged by the treatment of employees and the lack of this gentleman's rights to appeal when he was detained. There were a lot of angry messages online attacking Huawei and even calling for a boycott of the national champion within China itself. And why am I talking about a PR issue for a company in China? Well, what's interesting is that a lot of these comments and these commentaries that were critical of Huawei and Huawei's management of this, what was essentially an employment dispute, were censored within China itself. Which is interesting because for a company that says that it's completely private and that it does not rely on government support, did enjoy the protection of central government censors. So that's worth thinking about. Now, this next story is about China-US relations. The lower house in the US passed the Uighur bill, which calls on Trump to condemn the activities of the Beijing government in Xinjiang and empowers the US government to impose sanctions on top communist officials in the Chinese government, including within the Politburo, which are basically the top dogs. Imagine you get the top dogs within the US Senate, House of Representatives, the US Cabinet, and the Supreme Court, put them all in a room. That is essentially the Politburo of the CCP in China. So there's sanctions on these top officials, which is pretty unprecedented. Some of these people are named by name within the act itself. This bill passed in the House 407-1. So to call this effort bipartisan would be an understatement. This bill actually originated in the Senate. I think it was sponsored by Senator Rubio and a few others originally. I'm not sure on that point, but it started in the Senate and went to the House, and the House produced an even stronger bill in terms of sanctions on Chinese officials. So now it has to go back to the Senate, and it will most likely pass. And like the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, will likely be veto-proof, which means that the US President Trump will most probably be forced to sign it, even if he does not want to wade into this issue while he's negotiating trade issues with the Chinese. Now, Beijing's response to this, the rhetoric that it used was swift and intense. It really struck a nerve with the Chinese government. I think we were just talking about their response to the Hong Kong Act. The response to this, the language was even stronger. The Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said that the Americans were hypocrites and that the American system was built on the corpses of Native American Indians. This is incredibly extreme language from a ministry, from a foreign ministry, from diplomats. Very, very strong language. Any attempt of foreign countries to get involved in Chinese domestic politics, particularly in sensitive parts of the country like Xinjiang or Hong Kong, is going to receive a very strong verbal pushback from Chinese officials and the government in Beijing. But there are very few concrete policy moves that the Chinese can make against the United States at this point, unless they want to completely decouple the economic and the financial relationship, which it seems they are not prepared to do at this point in time. So this rhetoric will continue, and it will probably increase in intensity on both sides, but you're unlikely going to see a serious economic decoupling, even with the escalation in the trade war. Okay, now let's quickly give a trade war update. Not much has actually happened. There has been a lot of speculation, but nothing concrete has really come out. Look, what we do know is that both sides do want a deal. It will come down to what the details are. The devil's in the details, like they say, but both sides do want something to happen. With the signing of these controversial acts in the United States, the Chinese, despite their rhetoric, have still indicated that they want to get a trade deal across the line. The so-called Phase 1 trade agreement is still up in the air. Viewers of the show know that the two major issues that are being debated at the moment are, one, how much the Chinese agreed to in terms of agricultural purchases. They say 20 billion pre-trade war levels. Trump administration saying it's closer to 50 billion. This seems very unlikely, but that's one question. The other question, and what I think is the more serious question, is whether the US will peel back the tariffs that they've already imposed. The Chinese say this is a prerequisite. The Americans say, no, we need this in place as leverage to ensure that these IP protections go through in China, to ensure these purchases happen in China. Basically, a way of ensuring that the Chinese live up to the word. That's what the American side is saying. And there's still a question as to whether the tariffs that were set to go on Chinese goods on the 15th of December, which would be hundreds of billions of dollars, will go forward. That deadline is still there, and it's unclear whether there's going to be pushed back, whether there's going to be no increase, or whether there will be an increase. There is different statements that are coming out of the Trade Rep's office, from the White House, from the Chinese side. At the moment, we have no idea exactly what is going on. All we know is that both sides do want a deal, that the Chinese need a deal more than the Americans, but that does not necessarily mean that the Chinese will be the first to blink, as it were. We are heading into 2020. The US president is aware that it's an election year, that he wants a strong economy going into that year, he wants a strong stock market going into that year, so that could affect his decision to sign on to a deal that isn't perfect from his perspective, but will allow for a short to medium term boost in the stock market and in economic activity in the US. But again, this is a speculation. I will continue to update you guys when something concrete and real is released. Now, the last story I want to talk to you guys about Chinese officials and diplomats on Twitter. This is actually, I think, a big deal and is going to be increasingly important going forward. So over the last several months, many high-profile Chinese diplomats, officials have gone on Twitter and have been very, very outspoken on the platform. In some cases, not acting particularly diplomatic, if you ask me. This week, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself got on the platform. There was also an interesting report by Reuters this week, which was discussing the Foreign Affairs Minister, Wang Yi, at an official meeting last month with top officials and diplomats, discussing the need to increase propaganda work overseas, be involved on foreign media platforms, and to show a, quote, fighting spirit. Now, since that time, there have been more Twitter and other social media accounts that have been opened by top officials within the Chinese government who've been very outspoken and very assertive with their rhetoric. Now, it's also worth remembering that Twitter is banned in China. The Chinese have a closed internet system, and information dissemination is controlled essentially by the state. So they're using these social media platforms in open societies and open countries overseas, Western and developed economies overseas, but the rhetoric on the platform cannot go back into China itself. From my perspective, we need to take a step back and see this development as part of a wider information/propaganda push the Chinese state has been doing over the last couple of years. The importance of narrative, information dissemination, and language, and the effect that it has on the behavior of the wider society is a key aspect to traditional and modern Chinese philosophy. This idea goes all the way back to Confucius, through Neo-Confucianism to Mao Zedong thought, and can be seen in its practical application today in China through China's advanced and sophisticated censorship system that it uses domestically. It is not unreasonable to think that Chinese governance philosophy will also be infused with foreign policy. You are going to likely see a China that is more assertive in pushing certain language and narratives in its dealings overseas, and using its economic leverage to ensure that foreign institutions, companies, even individuals like politicians and bureaucrats support that narrative and that use of language going forward. What happened with the NBA a few months ago is not an isolated example. It is part of a wider push to be more assertive in pushing a certain narrative overseas to promote Chinese interests internationally. The NBA story, the South Park, all these sort of stuff, this was not the first case of this happening, nor will they be the last case. Okay, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate the support. I hope you like this episode. Please smash that like button if you're still here. I will see you guys next week for another China update. See you then.